Hello dear listeners, and a warm and gentle welcome to Soft History Channel, the quiet place where the past comes softly to life and carries you toward rest. Tonight we are going to step back nearly 2,000 years into the largest city the ancient world had ever known. Imagine waking in the dark, long before the sun, to the sound of wooden cartwheels grinding over stone, the rattling of iron, and the shouts of men driving tired oxen through narrow streets. Because in this city, the law forbids carts during the day, and so the work of moving the world is done at night. This is Rome, a city of more than 1 million souls, and most of them are poor. We tend to remember Rome for its emperors, its marble temples, its generals in golden armor, and its great battles fought far away. But beneath all of that glory lived the ordinary people, the workers, the sellers, the carriers, the cleaners, the families crowded into tall and crumbling buildings, the men and women whose names no history book ever wrote down. Tonight we are not going to follow a ruler or a hero. We are going to follow a single ordinary day. From the cold hour before dawn to the last lamp going dark, in the life of a poor Roman, we will climb the stairs to a tiny rented room, walk the loud and crowded streets, sweat through long hours of hard work, rest in the warm baths, and return home again as the light fades. This is the story of the people who truly built and carried the greatest city of the ancient world. But before we go any further, I want to take a moment. On this channel, we explore fascinating subjects in calm and careful detail. These journeys are made to help you relax, focus, or simply enjoy the flow of discovery. I would love to know where you are listening from today. Is it day or night where you are? What time is it? Are you tuning in while studying, working, commuting, or simply winding down? Drop your answer in the comments below. It is always wonderful to hear from you. And if you enjoy content like this, please support the channel by liking this video and subscribing. It helps us bring you more of these journeys. So let us go back now to a single morning in ancient Rome and step quietly into a day that begins long before the sun. The city does not truly sleep. Even in the deepest part of the night, the streets of Rome are alive with sound. The air is cool and damp, carrying the smell of smoke, of animals, of the river, and of 1,000 things rotting and baking and burning all at once. Long lines of carts move slowly through the dark, their wheels worn smooth by years of stone, their drivers calling out to one another in tired voices. These men carry grain and stone and timber and clay into the heart of the city, because during the daylight hours, the streets are far too crowded for wagons, and so the rule is simple. The work of supply happens in the dark. A poor Roman lying awake in his bed hears these sounds every single night, and he no longer truly notices them, the way a person living near the sea stops hearing the waves. The streets themselves are narrow, far narrower than we might imagine. Many of them are only wide enough for 2 people to pass each other, and the tall buildings on either side lean so close together that in some places a person could almost reach across from one window to another. There are no streetlights. There is no police force walking the lanes to keep order. After dark, the city belongs to the carters, the night workers, and the dangerous men who wait in the shadows. A faint glow comes from a few small fires here and there, where a baker has already begun his work, or where a watchman warms his hands. The cobblestones are slick with the damp of night, and the gutters run with whatever the day has left behind. It is a hard place, and it is about to grow much harder, because the sun is coming, and with the sun comes the great waking of 1 million people. High above the streets, in the upper floors of the towering buildings, the poor are beginning to stir. These buildings are called insulae, which simply means islands, and they rise 5, 6, sometimes 7 stories into the sky. From the outside they look impressive, great blocks of brick and concrete crowded together along every lane. But the higher you climb inside them, the worse the living becomes. And that is the strange truth of Roman housing. The rich lived low, and the poor lived high. The wealthy families took the ground floor, with its solid walls, its space, and its quick escape to the street. The poor were pushed upward, floor by floor, until the very poorest of all lived just beneath the roof, in small rooms reached by long and dangerous wooden stairs. Let us climb those stairs now, in the grey light before dawn. The steps are made of wood, worn and cracked, and they creak under every footfall. There is no handrail in many places, and the stairwell is dark and tight. As we climb, the air grows warmer and closer, thick with the smell of bodies, of old food, of smoke that has nowhere to go. We pass door after door, each one leading to a family crammed into a single room or two. At last we reach the top, where the ceilings are low and the walls are thin. And here we find the home of an ordinary poor family. A man, his wife, and their children, all living in a space smaller than many modern bedrooms. There is almost nothing inside. A few sleeping mats lie on the floor, stuffed with straw or rags. There is a small table, perhaps a stool or two, a single clay lamp, and a few worn pots and bowls. There is no running water up here, none at all. To get water, someone must carry it up all those stairs in a heavy jug from a public fountain far below, and so water is precious and used carefully. There is no proper kitchen and no fireplace, because the danger of fire in these wooden upper floors is so great that cooking is risky and often forbidden. The family huddles together for warmth in the cold months, because there is no heating of any kind. The walls let in the wind, and the roof above them leaks when the rain is heavy. This is shelter, but only barely, and every person who lives here knows it. The danger here is not only the cold and the crowding. These buildings were thrown up quickly and cheaply by landlords who cared only for profit, and many of them were poorly built. Fires broke out often, started by a knocked-over lamp or a cooking flame, and once a fire began in these upper floors, escape was terribly hard. The wooden stairs would burn, the smoke would fill the narrow halls, and there was no fire brigade in the earliest days to come and help. Whole buildings could burn to the ground in a single night, taking lives with them. Worse still, some of these tall buildings simply collapsed, their cheap walls giving way under their own weight. A poor Roman lived every day with the quiet knowledge that the very roof over his family could fall or burn, and yet, with no money for anything better, he stayed, and he made the best of the small space he could afford. In the dim light of the early morning, the family begins to wake. The father rises first, because his work begins early, and he must be at his labor before the sun is fully up. He moves carefully in the small space, trying not to wake the youngest children who still sleep on their mats. His wife stirs the embers of nothing, because there is no warm hearth to greet them, only the cold air of the room. The older children begin to move, rubbing the sleep from their eyes. There is no soft bedding to leave behind, no warm blankets, only thin coverings and the hard floor. The family dresses quickly in simple tunics, plain garments of rough wool that they wear day after day. These are the clothes of the working poor, undyed and patched, made to last rather than to please the eye. There is little time for comfort in these first minutes of the day. The room is too small for anyone to have privacy, and so the family moves around one another in a kind of practiced dance, each person knowing their place and their task. The mother checks what little food remains from the day before. The father gathers what he needs for his work, perhaps a tool or two, perhaps a small cloth to wipe the sweat that the day will surely bring. Through the single small window, the sky is beginning to lighten from black to a deep grey. The sounds of the city are changing now, the night carts fading away, and the first voices of the morning rising up from the streets below. The day is coming, ready or not, and a poor Roman family cannot afford to be late to meet it. The morning washing, if it can be called that, is a simple thing. There is no bath up here, no basin of warm water, no soap as we would know it. The family might splash a little of their precious carried water on their faces and hands, just enough to clear the sleep from their eyes. The Romans did not wash in the morning the way many of us do, because their great washing came later in the day at the public baths, where even the poorest could go for almost nothing. So the morning cleaning was quick and plain. The father rinses his face, runs his fingers through his hair, and that is nearly all. Cleanliness in the deepest sense waited for the afternoon, when the baths would open their doors and offer warmth and water to the whole city. The cold of the room presses on everyone in these early hours. In the winter months, the family's breath would show in the air, and the children would shiver beneath their thin coverings. There was no easy way to make the room warm, and the small clay lamp gave only the faintest heat. So the family did what people have always done in the cold. They stayed close, they moved quickly, and they did not linger. The mother might wrap a cloak around the smallest child, and the older ones would hug their arms across their chests as they stood. The poor of Rome learned to endure the cold the way they endured so many other hardships, with patience and with the quiet strength of people who had no other choice. As for breakfast, there was very little. The poor Roman did not sit down to a great morning meal. For most working people, the first food of the day was simple and small, often just a piece of bread, perhaps soaked in a little wine or water, perhaps with a smear of something to give it taste. There were no warm cooked meals here, because there was no kitchen to cook them in. Many poor families did not really eat a proper breakfast at all, saving their appetite and their few coins for later in the day. The children might be given a crust of bread to chew on as they began their morning. The father might eat almost nothing, planning instead to buy a quick bite from a street counter on his way to work. This was simply how the poor lived, eating little in the morning and finding their food out in the world as the day went on. Why did the poor have no kitchens of their own? The answer lies in the danger of fire and the way the buildings were made. A cooking fire in a crowded wooden upper floor was a deadly risk, and so most poor families simply did not cook at home. Instead, the city was filled with places to buy hot, ready-made food, cheap counters and shops on nearly every corner. This meant the poor depended on the street for much of what they ate. A man would buy a hot sausage or a bowl of stew or a piece of bread from a vendor rather than make it himself. In a strange way, the poor of ancient Rome lived much like some city dwellers today, who rarely cook and instead buy their meals from small shops nearby. The streets fed the poor, and the poor in turn kept those countless little food shops alive. With the small morning over, it is time to leave the room and begin the journey down into the city. The father says a few quiet words to his family, perhaps a blessing to the household gods whose tiny shrine sits in a corner of the room. Then he opens the door and steps out into the dim stairwell. The wooden steps creak beneath him as he begins the long descent, floor by floor, past the doors of his neighbors, who are also waking and stirring. The air grows louder and busier the lower he goes, the sounds of the street rising up to meet him. By the time he reaches the bottom, the full noise of morning Rome is washing over him, and he steps out from the dark stairwell into the waking world of the streets. The narrow lane outside is already filling with people. The shopkeepers are unbolting their heavy wooden shutters, swinging them open to reveal counters and goods inside. The smell of baking bread drifts through the air, warm and rich, rising from the ovens of bakers who have been at work since the darkest hours. The poor Roman breathes it in, and even on an empty stomach, it is a comfort. Around him, the lane comes alive with movement. Water sellers carry their jugs, children dart between the legs of grown men, and shopkeepers call out to one another in the easy way of people who see each other every single morning. The light is soft and golden now, slanting between the tall buildings and catching the dust that hangs in the air. The streets of Rome were a world unto themselves, loud and crowded and full of life and danger all at once. The lanes were so narrow that the crowds pressed close together, and a person walking had to weave and push to make any progress at all. There were no sidewalks in most places, no clear paths set aside for walkers. Carts and animals and people all shared the same stone surface, and the result was a constant tangle of bodies and noise. Above, the windows of the insulae looked down on the street, and from those windows came real danger, because people in the upper floors would sometimes toss their waste and dirty water straight down into the lane below. A careless walker could be soaked or struck by whatever came falling from above, and so a wise Roman kept one eye on the windows even as he watched his feet. Underfoot, the dangers were just as real. The stones of the street were uneven and slick, and the gutters ran with filth from the night before. There were puddles of muck, scraps of rotting food, the droppings of countless animals, and the runoff of a city with no easy way to keep itself clean. A man had to watch every step, especially in the crowded press of the morning. There were also the simple dangers of so many people moving at once. The risk of a stumble, a fall, a sudden shove. Thieves and pickpockets moved through the crowds as well, their quick fingers searching for a loose purse or an unguarded pocket. The poor Roman, who had little enough to begin with, learned to guard what small coins he carried with care, holding them close as he made his way. And yet, for all its dangers, the morning street was also a place of warmth and human connection. Neighbors greeted one another, vendors joked with their regular customers. Old friends met by chance and stopped to talk. The street was where the poor of Rome lived much of their lives, because their homes were so small and cramped that there was little reason to stay inside. Out here, in the lanes and at the counters, life happened. Bargains were struck, news was shared, and the slow business of a great city carried on. A poor Roman moving through this scene was part of something vast and alive, a single thread in a fabric of more than 1 million people, all waking and moving and beginning their day in the same crowded hour. The morning crowds had their own rhythm, their own flow, like water moving through narrow channels. In some places, the press of bodies was so great that movement nearly stopped, and a person had to wait and shuffle forward with everyone else. In other places, the lane opened up a little, and the walking grew easier. The poor Roman knew these streets well, knew which lanes were quickest, which corners were dangerous, which shops opened early. He moved through the city with the easy knowledge of a man who had walked these same paths thousands of times. The sun was higher now, and the grey of dawn had given way to the clear light of morning. The day's work was waiting, and like every working person in every age, the poor Roman went to meet it, one tired step at a time. Before the real labor of the day began, there was the matter of food, and for the poor of Rome, that meant a stop at one of the countless street counters that lined the lanes. These were called thermopolia, which simply means places that sell hot things, and they were the fast food shops of the ancient world. A thermopolium was usually a small open-fronted shop with a stone counter facing the street. Set into the counter were large clay jars, and these jars held food kept warm or stored for sale. Stews and porridges, beans and lentils, sometimes bits of meat or fish. A hungry Roman could walk up, hand over a small coin, and receive a quick hot meal to eat standing right there, or to carry away with him. For people who had no kitchens, these shops were a lifeline, and they were everywhere. The food at these counters was simple and filling, the kind of meal that gave a working person the strength to face long hours of labor. There might be a thick porridge made from grain, the most common food of the poor by far. There might be beans cooked soft, or lentils, or a stew of vegetables with perhaps a little meat for flavor. Bread was always at hand, dense and dark, the daily bread that kept the city fed. To drink, there was wine, but not wine as the rich drank it. The poor drank their wine watered down, sometimes heavily, because pure wine was both too strong and too costly. The watered wine was cheap, it was safer to drink than much of the city's water, and it gave a small comfort at the start of a hard day. A man might stand at the counter, eat his porridge, drink his watered wine, and exchange a few words with the seller before moving on. At the very heart of the poor Roman's food was grain, and the story of grain in Rome is the story of how an empire kept its people alive. The single most important food for the common Roman was not meat or vegetables, but grain, made into bread or boiled into porridge. So important was grain that the Roman government took on the task of making sure the poor had enough of it. This was the famous grain dole, a system in which the state gave out free or very cheap grain to the citizens of Rome. Hundreds of thousands of poor Romans depended on this grain to survive. Without it, many would have gone hungry, and a hungry city was a dangerous city. The rulers of Rome understood this well, and so the grain kept flowing, carried by ship from distant lands across the sea and stored in great warehouses in the city. The way the grain dole worked was a remarkable thing for the ancient world. Eligible citizens would receive a fixed amount of grain on a regular basis, enough to feed themselves and help feed their families. They would go to the appointed place, present their right to the dole, and receive their measure of grain. Then they would take it to be ground into flour and baked into bread, or they would cook it themselves into porridge. This system was not charity in the way we might think of it. It was a tool of government, a way of keeping the vast population of the city fed and calm. A poor man who could count on his grain was far less likely to riot or rise up in anger, and so the grain became one of the foundations on which the whole peace of the city rested. The grain came from far away, and the journey it took to reach a poor Roman's bowl was a long one. Much of it was grown in distant lands across the sea, in great fields tended by countless workers. It was harvested, gathered, and loaded onto ships, which then sailed across the water to the ports of Italy. From there it was carried up the river or hauled by cart into the city, where it was stored in enormous warehouses. The whole system was vast and complex, involving farmers, sailors, merchants, dock workers, and officials, all working to keep the bread flowing to a million mouths. When we picture the poor Roman eating his simple porridge, we should remember that behind that humble bowl stood an entire empire of effort, stretching across seas and continents, all to feed the hungry people of the great city. So as the poor Roman finished his morning meal at the street counter, wiping the last of the porridge from his bowl and draining the last of his watered wine, he was taking part in one of the great achievements of his world, the feeding of a city larger than any that had come before. He may not have thought of it that way. To him it was simply breakfast, a quick and ordinary thing before a long day of work. But the bread in his hand and the grain in his bowl were the threads that held the whole city together, the quiet daily miracle that kept more than 1 million people from going hungry. With his stomach filled, however simply, he turned now toward his labor, ready to spend the long hours ahead, earning the few coins that would keep his family fed for one more day. The work of a poor Roman could take many forms, but nearly all of it was hard, and much of it was dangerous. The city ran on the labor of countless ordinary people, and these workers filled every corner of Roman life. Down at the docks along the river, men hauled heavy sacks of grain and great jars of oil and wine from the boats to the warehouses. This was brutal work, lifting and carrying loads that bent the back and strained every muscle, hour after hour in the heat. The dock workers were the muscle that kept the city supplied, and their labor never truly ended, because the ships kept coming and the goods kept flowing. A man who worked the docks would come home each night with aching arms and a sore back, having moved more weight in a day than most of us move in a month. Construction was another great source of work for the poor, because Rome was always building. New buildings rose, old ones were repaired, roads were laid, and great public works took shape across the city. Construction work was heavy and risky. Men carried stone and brick, mixed and hauled the concrete that the Romans had mastered, climbed wooden scaffolding high above the ground, and worked with simple tools and the strength of their own bodies. There were no machines to lift the heavy loads, no safety equipment to protect a falling man. Accidents were common, and a serious injury could end a worker's ability to earn a living forever. Yet the building never stopped, because the city was always growing and changing, and there was always more work for strong hands willing to do it. Beyond the docks and the building sites, the poor worked in countless small shops and workshops scattered throughout the city. There were workers who made pottery, shaping wet clay into pots and bowls and lamps. There were those who worked leather, cutting and stitching it into shoes and bags and belts. There were carpenters, metal workers, weavers, dyers, and makers of every kind of small thing the city needed. These craftsmen and their helpers worked long hours in cramped and often hot workshops, their hands stained and calloused by their trade. Some of these workers were free poor men earning a wage, and some were slaves, and often they worked side by side at the same tasks. The skill of these workers was real, passed down and learned through years of practice, even if the world rarely honored them for it. Among the strangest and least pleasant of all the trades was the work of the fullers, the men who cleaned and treated cloth and clothing. The fullers ran a kind of ancient laundry, and their work depended on a most unusual ingredient. To clean wool and remove the grease from it, they used aged human urine, which they collected in large jars, set out in the streets for people to use. The workers would stamp on the cloth in vats of this mixture, with their bare feet, day after day, to clean and soften it. The smell of a fuller's shop was powerful and unpleasant, and the work was unglamorous in every way. Yet it was necessary, because the people of Rome needed clean clothing, and so the fullers labored on, performing one of the many humble and difficult jobs that kept the great city running. The streets themselves were full of working poor, the sellers and hawkers who made their living by trade. There were vendors who sold food from carts and baskets, calling out their wares to the passing crowds. There were sellers of small goods, trinkets, charms, ribbons, and household things. There were men who carried water, men who carried messages, men who would do almost any small task for a coin. These street workers had no shop of their own and no steady wage. They lived by their wits and their voices, earning a little here and a little there, never sure how much the day would bring. It was an uncertain way to live, dependent on the kindness of crowds and the luck of the day. And yet for many of the poor, it was the only work they could find. The wages for all this hard labor were small, painfully small by any measure. A poor Roman worker might earn just enough in a day to feed himself and perhaps his family, with little or nothing left over. There was no saving for the future, no cushion against hard times. If a man fell sick and could not work, the money simply stopped, and the family went hungry. If the work dried up, as it sometimes did, there was little to fall back on. The poor lived day to day, hand to mouth, their survival tied to their ability to keep working. This is a hardship that working people in every age have known, the fear of what happens if the labor stops, and the Romans knew it as deeply as anyone ever has. The hours of work were long, stretching from the early morning until the afternoon, and sometimes beyond. The Romans did not have the clear divisions of time that we know, no fixed 8-hour day, no weekends as we understand them. Work began when the light came and continued through the heat of the day. There were holidays and festival days when work stopped and the city celebrated, and these were a real relief to the working poor. Days of rest and free entertainment scattered through the year. But on an ordinary working day, the labor was long and the rest was short. A man gave the best of his strength to his work, and by the time the heat of midday came, he was already weary, his tunic soaked with sweat, his hands aching from the tasks he had performed. Despite all this hardship, there was a kind of dignity in the work of the poor Roman. He may have been poor, his wages small, and his future uncertain, but his labor mattered. The grain he carried fed the city, the walls he built sheltered its people, the pots he shaped held their food and their oil, the cloth he cleaned clothed their bodies. Without the countless hands of the working poor, the great city of Rome could not have stood for a single day. The emperors and senators and generals are the ones we remember, but it was the dock worker, the builder, the potter, and the seller who truly kept the empire alive. Their work was hard and their reward was small, but it was real, and it was the foundation on which all the glory of Rome was built. Among the workers of Rome, sharing their labor and their streets, were the slaves, and to understand the life of the poor, we must understand them too, for their story is woven through every part of Roman life. This part of the story is one that must be told honestly, even in a quiet telling like this one. A great many people in Rome were slaves, men, women, and children, who were not free, who were owned by other people, the way one might own a tool or an animal. They had no rights of their own, no freedom to come and go, no power over their own lives. They had often been captured in wars in distant lands. or born into slavery, or sold into it through debt or misfortune. They came from many places and many peoples, brought to Rome against their will, and they formed a huge part of the city's working population. The lives of slaves varied greatly depending on where they served and who owned them. Some slaves worked in the homes of the wealthy, serving as cooks, cleaners, attendants, and helpers of every kind. A household slave who served a kind master might have a somewhat bearable life, with food, shelter, and perhaps even some affection from the family they served. But they were still not free, and their fate rested entirely in the hands of others. Other slaves worked in shops and workshops alongside free workers, doing the same hard labor. And some slaves suffered the very worst fates of all, sent to work in mines or on great estates, where the labor was crushing and the conditions were deadly. For these unfortunate souls, life was brutally short and filled with suffering. What makes the story of slavery so important to understanding the poor of Rome is how thin the line between them often was. A free poor man and a slave might work side by side at the same task, performing the same labor, living in similar hardship. The free man had his freedom, which was precious beyond measure, but he might be just as hungry, just as tired, just as poor as the slave beside him. In some ways, the free poor and the slaves shared the same world, the same streets, the same struggles, and the line between them could be crossed. A free person who fell into deep debt might lose their freedom, and a slave, in some cases, could earn or be granted their freedom, becoming a freed person who joined the ranks of the free poor. The freeing of slaves was a real and important part of Roman life. A slave who served well, or who managed to save enough to buy their freedom, or who was simply granted it by a generous master, could become free. These freed people were called freedmen and freedwomen, and they occupied a special place in Roman society. They were free, but they often still carried obligations to their former masters, and they bore the mark of their past. Many freed people worked hard and built decent lives, and some even grew wealthy through trade and skill. The children of freed people were born fully free, with all the rights of any other Roman. And so the world of slavery and the world of the free poor were not entirely separate, but flowed into one another, with people sometimes moving from one to the other across the course of a lifetime. We should not soften the truth of what slavery was. It was a system built on the suffering and the stolen freedom of millions of human beings. The slaves of Rome lived without the most basic right of all, the right to belong to themselves. They could be bought and sold, separated from their families, punished cruelly, and worked to death, all according to the will of those who owned them. The wealth and comfort of Rome rested heavily on their backs. The fine homes of the rich, the smooth running of their households, the labor of their fields and mines, all of it depended on people who had no choice in the matter. This is a hard truth, but it is the truth, and the lives of the poor cannot be honestly told without it. And yet, the slaves were human beings, with their own hopes, their own families, their own quiet dignity in the face of a cruel fate. They formed friendships, they fell in love, they raised children when they were allowed to. They held on to the customs and gods of their distant homelands. They found small ways to endure, small moments of comfort and connection in lives that the world tried to strip of all meaning. Some held on to the hope of freedom, working and saving and waiting for the day they might call themselves free. Their resilience, their ability to remain human in the most inhuman of circumstances, is its own kind of quiet strength. The strength of people who refused to be reduced to mere property, even when the world insisted they were nothing more. The presence of so many slaves shaped the lives of the free poor in complicated ways. On one hand, the slaves shared their struggles and their streets, fellow sufferers in a hard world. On the other hand, the cheap labor of slaves could make it harder for free poor people to find work and earn a decent wage, because why pay a free man when a slave could do the same task for the cost of their food and shelter? This created a strange tension, a world where the free poor and the slaves were both at the bottom of society. sometimes in sympathy with one another, and sometimes in competition. It was a hard arrangement, one that pressed down on everyone who lived without wealth or power, free and enslaved alike. To walk through the streets of Rome, then, was to walk among both free poor and slaves, often unable to tell at a glance which was which, for they wore similar simple clothing and did similar humble work. They were the great mass of ordinary people, on whose labor the whole city stood. When we picture the poor Roman going about his day, we must picture this mixed and crowded world, where freedom and slavery existed side by side, where the line between them was thin and could be crossed, and where human beings of every kind struggled together to survive. It is a story with much darkness in it, but it is also a story of endurance, of people holding on to their humanity in the hardest of circumstances, and that endurance deserves to be remembered. By the time the sun climbed toward the top of the sky, the poor Roman might find himself passing through the great public space at the very center of the city. This was the Forum, the beating heart of Rome, and at midday, it roared with life. The Forum was a wide open space, surrounded by grand buildings, temples, halls and monuments, where the public business of the city was carried out. Here came people of every kind, rich and poor, free and enslaved, citizens and visitors from distant lands. The space was crowded shoulder to shoulder with a great press of humanity, and the noise of it all rose into the air like the sound of a vast and restless sea. For a poor Roman, the Forum was a place to pass through, to do business, to hear the news, and to feel the full pulse of the city. The Forum was where deals were made and disputes were settled. Merchants and traders gathered to buy and sell, to strike bargains and exchange goods. Men of business hurried from place to place, their minds full of money and trade. In the great halls that lined the space, courts were held, and lawsuits were argued before judges and crowds. A poor Roman might come here to settle some small matter of his own, or simply to watch the spectacle of important men arguing their cases. The courts were a kind of public entertainment, drawing crowds who came to listen to the clever speeches and the heated arguments. The drama of the law played out in the open air, and the people of the city watched and listened and formed their own opinions about who was right and who was wrong. The Forum was also the great gathering place for news and gossip. In a world without newspapers, the way people learned what was happening was by word of mouth, and the Forum was where word of mouth flowed fastest. Here a man could learn the latest news, the rumors of the day, the talk of who had done what and who had said what. Politicians and public figures came here to be seen and to speak, knowing that the crowds of the Forum carried news to every corner of the city. A poor Roman standing in the Forum was at the center of the city's flow of information, soaking up the talk and the rumors that he would later share with his neighbors and friends. The Forum was, in a sense, the great mouth of the city, always speaking, always passing along the news of the day. The grand buildings that surrounded the Forum spoke of the power and glory of Rome. There were temples to the gods, their tall columns rising toward the sky, their steps worn smooth by countless feet. There were great public halls where business and law were conducted. There were monuments and statues honoring famous men and great victories. To a poor Roman, these buildings were a daily reminder of the vast power of the city he lived in, a power that touched his life in countless ways, even as he remained at the bottom of its order. He might pause to look up at a great temple, feeling small beneath its towering columns, aware that he was a tiny part of something immense and ancient and powerful beyond his understanding. Yet for all its grandeur, the Forum belonged to everyone and to no one. The poor moved through it just as the rich did, sharing the same space, breathing the same air, jostling in the same crowds. A poor man might brush shoulders with a wealthy senator, might overhear the talk of important men, might stand in the shadow of buildings he could never dream of entering as anything but a servant. The Forum was a place where the great divisions of Roman society came together in one crowded space. the rich and the poor mingling in the press of the midday crowd. There was something both grand and humbling in this, the way the heart of the empire was open to all who walked its streets, even as it reminded each person exactly where they stood in the order of things. The midday hour was the busiest time in the Forum, when the heat of the day was building and the crowds were at their thickest. The sun beat down on the open space, and there was little shade to be found in the press of bodies. The noise was tremendous. 1,000 conversations layered over one another, the calls of vendors, the arguments of the courts, the general roar of a great crowd. The air was thick with dust kicked up by countless feet, and the smell of so many people gathered together. For a poor Roman, moving through this scene was both exciting and exhausting, a wave of sound and motion and humanity that swept him along whether he wished it or not. He would do his business, hear his news, and then move on, glad perhaps to escape the crush of the crowd. The Forum was the place where the poor Roman felt most fully a part of the great life of the city. Here, he was not alone in his small room, or bent over his work, but standing in the very center of the world, surrounded by the full energy of Rome. Whatever his hardships, whatever his poverty, in the Forum, he was one of the people of the greatest city on earth, sharing in its noise and its life and its endless busy motion. There was a strange comfort in this, in being part of something so vast and alive. The poor man might own nothing of value, might live in a tiny rented room, might labor for small coins, but he belonged to Rome, and Rome belonged to him, at least in this one open space where all the city came together. And then, having taken in the roar of the Forum at its loudest hour, the poor Roman would turn his thoughts toward rest and food. For even in the busy middle of the day, there came a pause. The heat was at its height now, and the body grew weary. It was time to step away from the crush of the crowd, to find a little shade, to fill the stomach once more, and to gather strength for the rest of the day. The great roar of the Forum would carry on without him, as it always did, but he would step aside for a time, seeking the small comfort of a quiet corner and a simple meal in the hottest part of the Roman day. In the heat of midday, the poor Roman sought a moment of rest. The pace of the city did not stop entirely, but it slowed, as the worst of the sun's heat pressed down on the streets and squares. This was the time to pause, to step out of the relentless motion of the morning, and to take a simple meal in whatever shade could be found. A poor man might settle in a doorway, his back against the cool stone, sheltered from the glare of the sun. Or he might return to one of the street counters, leaning against it to eat as the crowds thinned a little in the heat. The midday meal was not grand, but it was welcome, a chance to fill the stomach and rest the weary body before the afternoon. The food of this midday pause was simple, the plain fare of the poor. There would be bread, always bread, the dense dark bread that was the foundation of the Roman diet. There might be olives, those small bitter fruits, so common across the lands around the Great Sea, eaten by rich and poor alike. There might be a bit of cheese, sharp and salty, a small pleasure that gave the meal some richness. Perhaps there were a few vegetables, an onion, some greens, whatever was cheap and in season. And there would be the watered wine again, that thin, sour drink that washed down the meal and gave a small lift to the spirits. It was a humble meal, but it was enough. And for a hungry working man, it was a real comfort in the middle of a hard day. There was a particular pleasure in eating in the shade on a hot day, a simple joy that the poor could share with anyone, rich or poor. The cool of a shadow after the heat of the sun, the rest of sitting after hours of standing and working, the satisfaction of food in an empty stomach. These were pleasures that needed no wealth to enjoy. A poor Roman, settling into a shaded doorway with his bread and olives, might feel for a moment a kind of contentment. The morning's work was done, the worst of the heat would soon pass, and there was food in his hands and a little rest for his body. In these small moments, the hardships of poverty eased just a little, and the simple goodness of being alive could be felt even by those who had almost nothing. The streets themselves grew quieter in this hottest part of the day. The crowds thinned as people sought shade and rest. Some shops might close their shutters for a time, their owners resting through the worst of the heat. The animals stood still, in whatever shade they could find. Even the great forum grew a little less frantic as the sun beat down. There was a kind of hush over the city. Not silence, for Rome was never silent, but a softening, a slowing, a collective pause in the rhythm of the day. The poor Roman, resting in his doorway, was part of this great slowing, joining countless others across the city in the simple act of waiting for the heat to pass. This midday rest was important because the work of the morning had been hard and the body needed to recover. A man who labored from dawn could not keep up that pace through the whole long day without a break. The pause in the heat gave his muscles a chance to ease, his breathing a chance to slow, his mind a chance to settle. It was during these quiet moments that a poor Roman might let his thoughts wander, might think of his family in their small room high above the streets, might consider the work still ahead, or might simply rest his mind and think of nothing at all. The body and the spirit both needed these pauses, and the wisdom of the day's rhythm built them in. As the worst of the heat began to pass, the poor Roman would gather himself for what came next. He had worked through the morning, eaten his simple meals, taken his rest in the shade. Now the afternoon stretched ahead, and with it came one of the great pleasures of Roman life, a pleasure that even the poorest could afford. For all his hardships, the poor Roman had access to something that would have seemed a luxury in many other times and places, something that brought warmth and comfort and ease to the end of his working day. The thought of it would draw him onward through the afternoon, a small bright point to look forward to after the labor was done. Slowly the man rose from his shaded rest, brushing the crumbs from his tunic, feeling the stiffness in his legs ease as he stood. The sun had passed its highest point now and begun its long, slow fall toward the west. The streets were beginning to fill again as people emerged from their midday rest, the city stirring back into its full motion. The poor Roman stretched, took a breath of the warm afternoon air, and prepared to move on. There was perhaps more work to be done, or errands to run, or simply the slow walk toward the great pleasure that awaited him later in the day. Whatever lay ahead, he was rested now, fed now, ready to face the remaining hours. And so the quiet pause of midday came to its end, that small, still center in the middle of the loud and busy Roman day. It was a reminder that even in the hardest of lives, there were moments of rest and small comfort, moments when the weary body could ease, and the simple pleasures of food and shade could be enjoyed. The poor Roman carried these small comforts with him as he moved back into the flow of the city, knowing that the best part of his day was still to come, in the warm and welcoming halls of the public baths, where the whole city went to wash away the dust and weariness of the long day's labor. The public baths were the great glory of ordinary Roman life, and they were a pleasure that even the poorest could enjoy. For just a tiny coin, a poor Roman could spend his afternoon in the baths, and these were not simple washrooms, but vast and beautiful buildings, filled with warmth and water and comfort. To step into the baths after a long day of dusty, hard labor was to enter another world, a world of steam and warmth and ease. The baths were one of the few places where the great divisions of Roman society softened, where a poor man could enjoy nearly the same comfort as a rich one. This was the daily luxury of the common people, and it stood at the very center of their lives, the bright and welcome heart of the Roman afternoon. The baths were built on a grand scale, especially the great public baths that the emperors built for the people. A bathhouse might cover an enormous area, with high ceilings, marble floors, beautiful columns, and rooms of every kind. There were changing rooms where a person left their clothing, exercise yards where people could move and play before bathing, and the bathing rooms themselves, each kept at a different temperature. The buildings were warmed by a clever system that ran hot air beneath the floors and through the walls, so that the rooms grew warmer as you moved deeper inside. The Romans were masters of this kind of engineering, and the result was a place of remarkable comfort, where warmth surrounded the bather on every side. The bathing itself followed a pleasant rhythm, moving from room to room through different temperatures. A bather would often begin in a warm room, letting the heat ease into tired muscles and open the pores of the skin. Then they might move to the hot room, the hottest of all, filled with steam, where the heat was almost overwhelming and the sweat poured freely from the body. This was where the dust and grime of the day were sweated out, where the weariness of labor was cooked away in the thick, warm air. After the hot room came the cold plunge, a pool of cool or cold water that closed the pores and refreshed the body with a sudden bracing shock. To move from the heat of the steam room to the chill of the cold pool was to feel wonderfully alive, the body tingling and awake. The Romans did not have soap as we know it. Instead, they cleaned themselves in a particular way. A bather would rub oil onto their skin and then use a curved metal tool called a strigil to scrape the oil away, and with it, the dirt and sweat of the day. The strigil scraped along the skin, lifting away all the grime, leaving the body clean. This was the Roman method of washing, and it worked well. A poor Roman, like everyone else, would oil and scrape himself clean in the baths, removing the dust of the streets and the sweat of his labor. For people who could not easily wash at home, where there was no water and no warmth, the baths were the place where true cleaning happened, the daily ritual that kept the body fresh. But the baths were far more than a place to get clean. They were the great social center of Roman life, the place where the whole city came together to relax and talk and enjoy one another's company. People came to the baths not just to wash, but to spend time, to meet friends, to share news and gossip, to do business, to play games, and simply to enjoy themselves. The baths were filled with the sound of conversation, of laughter, of voices echoing off the high ceilings. A poor Roman could come here and be part of this rich social world, talking with friends and neighbors, sharing the events of the day, feeling the warmth of human company, along with the warmth of the water. In a hard life, the baths offered not just physical comfort, but the comfort of belonging, of being among others. There was much to do at the baths, beyond the bathing itself. In the exercise yards, people would play ball games, lift weights, or wrestle, getting their bodies moving and working up a sweat before they bathed. There were vendors selling food and drink, so a person could eat and refresh themselves. There were people offering massages, rubbing tired muscles back to life. There were quiet corners where a person could simply sit and rest. The baths were a place to spend a whole afternoon, a place of leisure and pleasure in the middle of a hard-working life. For the poor Roman, who had so few luxuries, the baths offered hours of comfort and enjoyment for the smallest of costs. And this is why they were so beloved by the common people. The warmth of the baths was a deep and welcome thing, especially for people whose homes were cold and cramped. To sink into the warmth after a long day, to feel the heat ease the aches from one's muscles, to let the steam rise around the body, was a pleasure of the simplest and most profound kind. The poor Roman, who lived in a chilly room high above the streets, with no heating and little comfort, could come to the baths and be surrounded by warmth on every side. The contrast must have been wonderful. The move from the hard cold of home and the dusty heat of the streets to the controlled and pleasant warmth of the bathhouse. It was a comfort that touched the body and soothed the spirit, a daily gift that the great city gave to even its poorest people. There was a kind of equality in the baths that was rare in Roman life. In the baths, stripped of their clothing, men were simply men, without the fine garments that marked the rich apart from the poor. A wealthy man and a poor man might bathe in the same pool, sit in the same steam room, share the same warmth. The great differences of wealth and status did not entirely disappear, for the rich had their attendants and their finer ways. But in the shared warmth of the water, the people of the city came together in a way they did almost nowhere else. For a poor Roman, this was a precious thing, a daily reminder that some pleasures belong to everyone, that warmth and water and rest were not only for the wealthy, but for all who lived in the great city. As the afternoon wore on in the baths, the poor Roman would feel the weariness of the day melting away, replaced by a deep and pleasant relaxation. His muscles, sore from labor, would ease in the warmth. His skin, scraped clean of the day's grime, would feel fresh and new. His spirit, refreshed by the company of others and the simple pleasures of the bath, would lift. This was the high point of his day, the reward for all the hard work that had come before. He would emerge from the baths in the late afternoon, clean and warm and rested, ready to face the journey home as the light began to soften toward evening. The baths had given him what little luxury his life allowed, and he carried that comfort with him as he stepped back out into the city. Along with the baths, the poor Roman enjoyed another great gift from the city, one that cost him nothing at all. This was the free entertainment, the games and races and spectacles that filled the calendar of Rome with days of excitement and wonder. The rulers of Rome understood that the people needed more than just bread to keep them content. They needed pleasure, distraction, and the thrill of great spectacle, and so the city provided it, on a scale that no place had ever seen before. There were many days each year set aside for public games and entertainment, and on these days, the poor Roman could set aside his labor and join the vast crowds in enjoying the shows. This was a central part of life for the common people, a source of joy and excitement in lives that held much hardship. The greatest of all the entertainments were the chariot races, held in the enormous racing track called the Circus Maximus. This was a vast open space, longer than several modern sports fields laid end to end, surrounded by tiers of seating that could hold a crowd numbering in the hundreds of thousands. The poor Roman could come here, find a place among the great crowd, and watch the chariots thunder around the track. Teams of horses pulled light, fast chariots, driven by skilled drivers who raced at breakneck speed, taking the dangerous turns so close that crashes were common and often deadly. The crowd would roar with excitement, cheering for their favorite teams, which were known by their colors. The races were thrilling, fast, and dangerous, and the poor Roman could lose himself completely in the spectacle and the roar of the crowd. The teams in the chariot races were followed with a passion that is hard to describe. People supported their favorite team with all their hearts, wearing their colors, cheering wildly, and feeling real joy when their team won, and real sorrow when it lost. The rivalry between the teams was fierce, and the crowds were divided in their loyalties, much as people today follow their favorite sports teams with deep devotion. For a poor Roman, supporting a racing team was a way to belong, to be part of something larger than himself, to share in the excitement and passion of a great crowd. When his team won, he felt a joy that lifted him out of his daily hardships, a pure and simple happiness that cost him nothing and meant a great deal. Beyond the races, there were the spectacles of the arena, the games held in the great amphitheaters of the city. These were a darker form of entertainment, and they must be spoken of honestly. In the arena, trained fighters called gladiators fought one another, sometimes to the death, before crowds that came to watch. There were also displays involving wild animals brought from distant lands, hunts and fights that ended in much blood and death. These spectacles were brutal and violent, and many people died in them, both fighters and condemned criminals who were forced to face death for the crowd's entertainment. The poor Roman who attended these games was part of a culture that found entertainment in violence and death, a hard truth about the ancient world that we should not look away from. The reason the rulers provided all this free entertainment was a practical one, summed up in a famous phrase about bread and circuses. The idea was simple: if the people were fed and entertained, they would be content, and a content people would not rise up in anger against their rulers. The free grain kept the people fed, and the free games kept them entertained and distracted. In this way, the rulers of Rome kept the vast and potentially dangerous population of the city calm and peaceful. It was a clever strategy, and it worked for a very long time. The poor Roman, enjoying his free grain and his free games, was being managed by his rulers, kept happy and quiet, through the satisfaction of his basic needs and the thrill of spectacle. For all the darker truths behind the entertainment, we must understand what these spectacles meant to the poor Roman. His life was hard, his work was exhausting, his home was cramped and poor, and his future was uncertain. The games and races offered him an escape, a few hours of pure excitement and pleasure, a chance to forget his troubles and lose himself in the thrill of the spectacle. He could join a crowd of hundreds of thousands, feel the energy of the great mass of people, cheer and shout and feel alive. These were among the brightest moments of his year, days he looked forward to and remembered. In a life with few pleasures, the free entertainment of Rome was a real and important joy, however dark some of it was. The crowds at these great events were a spectacle in themselves. To gather hundreds of thousands of people in one place, all focused on the same event, all cheering and shouting together, created an energy that was overwhelming. The roar of such a crowd could be heard far across the city. The poor Roman, sitting among this vast multitude, was part of something immense, swept up in the collective excitement of his fellow citizens. There was a powerful feeling in being part of such a crowd, a sense of unity and shared experience that crossed the lines of wealth and status. Rich and poor alike came to the games, and in the shared excitement of the spectacle, they were, for a time, united in their enjoyment, all subjects of the same great city, all caught up in the same thrilling show. After the excitement of the games or races, the poor Roman would make his way home through the streets, his ears still ringing with the roar of the crowd, his spirit lifted by the spectacle he had witnessed. These days of entertainment were precious breaks in the hard rhythm of his life, bright spots that he would remember and look forward to. The bread fed his body, and the circuses fed his spirit, and together they made his hard life more bearable. He returned to his ordinary days carrying the memory of the excitement, knowing that there would be more games, more races, more spectacles in the days and weeks to come, more chances to escape his troubles and join the great crowds of Rome in the shared joy of the show. Yet for all the pleasures of the baths and the games, the life of the poor Roman was shadowed always by danger to the body, for sickness and injury were constant threats, and the body of a poor person was a fragile thing. This part of the story must also be told honestly, for it was a heavy weight on every poor family. Disease was everywhere in the crowded city. With so many people packed together in narrow streets and tight buildings, illness spread easily from person to person. There was no understanding of germs as we have today, no knowledge of how sickness truly traveled from one body to another. When disease came, it could sweep through a neighborhood, striking down the young and the old, the weak and even the strong, leaving families broken and grieving. The water of the city, though Rome was famous for bringing fresh water through its great channels, was not always safe. The poor, living high in their buildings, often could not easily reach the cleanest water, and the water they did get might be tainted in ways no one understood. Bad water could carry sickness, causing terrible illnesses of the stomach and bowels that could kill, especially the very young. The conditions of the crowded poor neighborhoods, with their waste and their filth, bred disease. A poor Roman lived surrounded by these dangers, never knowing when a fever might take hold, when a sickness might strike his family, when the fragile health of his children might fail. It was a constant low fear, woven into the fabric of daily life. Injury was another ever-present danger, especially for those who did hard physical labor. A dock worker might be crushed by a falling load, a builder might fall from the scaffolding, or be struck by a falling stone. A craftsman might suffer a deep cut or a burn. In a world without our modern medicine, even a wound that we would consider minor could become deadly, growing infected and spreading poison through the body. A serious injury could end a man's ability to work, and for a poor family that depended on his labor, this was a catastrophe. There was no safety net to catch a man who could no longer earn his living. The fragile body of the poor Roman was his only tool, and when it was broken, his whole world could collapse. The medicine of the ancient world could do only so much. There were doctors in Rome, and some of them were skilled, and learned by the standards of their time. They knew certain remedies, certain herbs and treatments, certain ways to set broken bones or treat wounds. But their understanding of the body and of disease was limited. They did not know what truly caused most illnesses, and many of their treatments did little good or even caused harm. For the poor, even this limited medicine was often out of reach, for the services of a doctor cost money that they did not have. A poor family facing illness often had to rely on simple home remedies, on folk cures, on prayers to the gods, and on hope. When sickness came, there was frequently little to be done but to wait, and to pray, and to endure. Death was a familiar visitor in the homes of the poor. Children especially were vulnerable, and many did not survive their early years. The grief of losing a child was something that far too many poor families knew, a sorrow that ran through the whole of ancient life. Mothers and fathers buried their little ones with aching hearts, and yet they had to carry on, for there was work to do and other children to feed. Life expectancy was short by our standards, and a person who lived to old age was fortunate indeed. The poor Roman lived always in the shadow of death, aware that life was uncertain and could be cut short at any time by illness, accident, or the simple wearing down of a body pushed too hard for too long. And yet, in the face of all this fragility, the poor Romans found ways to cope and to carry on. They cared for one another in times of sickness, families and neighbors helping the afflicted as best they could. They turned to their gods for protection and healing, offering prayers and small sacrifices in the hope of divine help. They held on to their loved ones and treasured the time they had together, knowing how easily it could be taken away. There was a toughness in the poor Roman, a hard-won strength that came from living always close to danger and death. They did not have the luxury of feeling safe, and so they learned to endure, to grieve, and to keep going, finding what joy and comfort they could in a world where life was uncertain and often brief. The fragility of the body shaped how the poor Roman saw the world and his place in it. He knew that his health was not guaranteed, that his strength could fail, that sickness could come at any time. This knowledge made the pleasures of life more precious, the warmth of the baths, the excitement of the games, the company of family and friends, the simple comfort of food and rest. When life is uncertain, the good moments shine more brightly, and the poor Roman, for all his hardships, knew how to find and treasure these moments. He lived close to the edge, and perhaps because of this, he lived with a certain intensity, valuing the small comforts and joys that brightened his hard and fragile existence. This honest look at sickness, injury and death reveals the harsh reality beneath the daily life of the poor Roman. For all the grandeur of the city, for all its baths and games and great buildings, the ordinary people lived with constant danger to their fragile bodies. They could be struck down at any time, and the medicine of their age could offer only limited help. And yet they endured, generation after generation, raising their families, doing their work, finding their pleasures, and facing their losses with a strength that deserves our deep respect. The poor Roman's life was fragile, but his spirit was strong, and in that strength lay the true endurance of the common people who made up the great mass of the city. In the face of all this uncertainty and hardship, the poor Roman turned to his gods, for faith was woven through every part of his daily life. Religion was not something kept apart for special days. It was present everywhere, in the home, in the street, in the workplace, in every corner of the city. The Romans worshipped many gods, great gods who ruled over the sky and the sea and the underworld, and smaller gods who watched over the home, the hearth, the crossroads, and the countless small concerns of daily life. For the poor Roman, this faith gave comfort and order to a hard and uncertain world. The gods could be asked for help, for protection, for good fortune, and in a life where so much was beyond control, this was a precious thing. In the home, even the smallest and poorest, there was usually a little shrine to the household gods. These were the gods who watched over the family and the home itself, protecting those who lived there. The shrine might be a simple thing, a small painted niche in the wall, or a little cupboard holding small figures of the protecting spirits. Each day, the family would honor these gods with small offerings: a bit of food, a few drops of wine, a prayer spoken softly. The father of the household led these little rituals, asking the household gods to keep the family safe and to bring good fortune. For a poor family living in fear of fire, collapse, sickness, and hunger, these daily prayers were a way of seeking protection, of placing their fragile lives in the care of powers greater than themselves. Out in the streets, the gods were present too. At the crossroads, where the lanes met, there were often small shrines to the spirits who watched over those places. People passing by might pause to make a small offering or whisper a prayer, asking for safe passage or good luck. There were gods for nearly every trade and activity, and a worker might honor the god connected to his particular labor. The whole city was dotted with these small sacred places, and the poor Roman moved among them every day, his life surrounded by reminders of the divine. This constant presence of the gods gave a sense of order to the world, a feeling that there were powers watching over the city and its people, powers that could be appealed to in times of need. The great temples of the city were grand places, far grander than the humble home shrines of the poor. These temples honored the major gods, and they were beautiful buildings with tall columns and richly decorated interiors. While the poor Roman might not enter the inner parts of these temples, which were reserved for priests, he could come to them, make his offerings, and join in the public worship. On festival days, great ceremonies were held at the temples, with processions, sacrifices, and public celebrations. The poor Roman could take part in these grand religious events, feeling himself connected to the great gods who protected the whole city and the whole empire. These were moments when his small life touched something vast and ancient and holy. The festivals of the religious calendar were a great source of joy and relief for the poor. Throughout the year, there were many days set aside to honor the various gods, and on these days, work often stopped and the city celebrated. These festivals combined religious ceremony with feasting, entertainment, and merrymaking. There were processions through the streets, with images of the gods carried for all to see. There were special meals and treats. There were the games and races that brought such pleasure to the people. For the poor Roman, these festival days were a welcome break from labor, a time to celebrate, to honor the gods, and to enjoy himself. Religion and pleasure were woven together, and the worship of the gods brought real joy into hard lives. Faith gave the poor Roman more than just festivals and rituals. It gave him a way to make sense of his world and his suffering. When sickness came, he could pray for healing. When danger threatened, he could ask for protection. When he faced hardship, he could believe that the gods were watching and might help. When he lost a loved one, he could find some comfort in beliefs about the dead and what lay beyond death. The gods gave him hope, that most precious thing, in a life where hope was often hard to find. To believe that powerful and watchful beings cared about his small life, that his prayers might be heard, that his offerings might be rewarded, gave the poor Roman strength to face his many troubles. There was a deeply personal quality to the faith of the poor. The household gods were intimate, close, part of daily family life. The small offerings and prayers were woven into the ordinary rhythm of the day, as natural as eating or sleeping. The poor Roman did not need wealth to honor his gods, for the gods could be served with simple offerings, a bit of food, a few words, a moment of respect. This made religion accessible to even the poorest, a comfort available to all, regardless of their means. In a world where so many good things were reserved for the wealthy, the comfort of faith was open to everyone, and the poor Roman could find in his gods a source of strength and hope that no amount of poverty could take from him. And so faith ran through the whole of the poor Roman's day, from the morning prayer at the household shrine, to the small offering at the crossroads, to the great festivals that punctuated the year. It was not a thing apart, but a constant presence, a thread woven through every hour. As the day drew toward its close, the poor Roman might pause once more to honor his gods, to thank them for bringing him safely through another day, to ask for their protection through the coming night. His faith was the quiet companion of his hard life, offering comfort, hope, and a sense of order in a world that often seemed cruel and uncertain. It was one of the deepest sources of strength for the common people, sustaining them through all their many trials. As the sun began its long, slow descent toward the western horizon, the poor Roman turned his steps toward home. The light grew softer and warmer, slanting golden between the tall buildings, casting long shadows across the streets. The heat of the day was fading now, and a cooler air was beginning to settle over the city. The shops were preparing to close, the shopkeepers swinging their heavy wooden shutters back into place and bolting them for the night. The crowds in the streets were thinning as people made their way home. The great busy day of Rome was winding down, and the poor Roman, tired from his labor but refreshed by the baths, joined the slow flow of people heading back to their homes as the evening approached. The walk home took the poor Roman back through the streets he had traveled in the morning, but the city looked different now in the fading light. The golden glow of evening softened the harsh edges of the day, and there was a kind of beauty in the way the light caught the tops of the buildings and turned the dust in the air to gold. People called out their farewells to one another. The last bits of business were concluded, and the sounds of the day began to give way to the quieter sounds of evening. The poor Roman moved through this scene, his thoughts perhaps turning to his family waiting in their small room, to the simple meal that awaited him, to the rest that his weary body craved after the long, hard day. But as the light faded, a different mood settled over the city, for the streets of Rome at night were dangerous places. There were no streetlights to push back the darkness. Once the sun went down, the lanes grew black and treacherous, lit only by the faint glow of the moon and stars when the sky was clear, or plunged into total darkness on cloudy nights. In this darkness, the city changed its character. The honest people hurried home and bolted their doors, while the darkness brought out those who preyed on others. Robbers and thieves lurked in the shadows, waiting for unwary travelers. The poor Roman, walking home in the failing light, knew the dangers well and quickened his pace, eager to reach the safety of his building before the darkness was complete. The danger of the night streets was a real and serious thing. A person caught out alone in the dark lanes might be robbed, beaten, or worse. There was no police force patrolling the streets to keep the peace, no quick help to be summoned if trouble came. The wealthy, when they went out at night, traveled with servants carrying torches to light the way and to protect them. But the poor Roman had no such protection. He had to make his own way through the darkening streets, relying on his knowledge of the lanes, his speed, and his luck. This is why most poor people simply stayed home after dark, shutting themselves into their small rooms and waiting for the morning. The night belonged to the darkness, and to those who used it for ill. As the poor Roman hurried through the gathering dark, the city around him was settling into its evening rhythm. Through the windows of the buildings, the faint glow of small lamps began to appear, tiny points of warm light in the deepening darkness. From within the homes came the sounds of families gathering, of evening meals being prepared, of the day's last activities. The smells of cooking, where cooking was possible, drifted out into the streets. The great roar of the daytime city was fading into the softer murmur of the evening, the sound of 1,000,000 people settling into their homes for the night. The poor Roman, nearly home now, could feel the day's end approaching, the welcome promise of rest after the long hours of labor. At last the poor Roman reached his building, the tall insula that rose into the darkening sky. He stepped into the dark stairwell and began the long climb back up to his room at the top, the same creaking wooden stairs he had descended in the morning. The climb was wearying after a long day, each step a small effort for his tired legs. Up he went, past the doors of his neighbors, past the floors where other families were settling in for the night. The higher he climbed, the more he felt the weariness of the day, but also the growing comfort of homecoming, the knowledge that his family waited for him at the top, that his day's journey was nearly done, that rest was finally near. The journey home at the end of the day was a daily ritual for the poor Roman, the closing of the circle that had begun in the dark hours of the morning. He had risen before dawn, descended into the waking city, labored through the long hours, found his pleasures and his rest, and now he returned, tired and spent, to the small room he called home. There was something deeply human in this rhythm, this daily going out and coming back, this cycle of work and return that working people have known in every age. The poor Roman was tired, but he was also coming home, and home, however small and poor, was where his family waited, where he belonged, where he could finally rest. As he reached the top of the stairs and approached the door of his room, the poor Roman could hear the faint sounds of his family within. The day was ending now. The darkness was complete outside, and the city was settling into its night. He had survived another day, earned his small wages, and returned safely to his family. The dangers of the dark streets were behind him now, and ahead lay the simple comforts of the evening, the last meal, the quiet of the room, and the rest that his weary body so deeply needed. He opened the door and stepped into the small space that was his home, into the warmth of family and the welcome end of the long Roman day. Inside the small room, the family gathered for the evening meal, the last food of the day, and often the most substantial. The single clay lamp burned softly, casting a warm and flickering light over the cramped space, pushing back the darkness that pressed against the small window. The family settled together to share what food they had. For the poor, the evening meal was simple, much like the food of the rest of the day: bread and porridge, perhaps some vegetables, olives, a bit of cheese, and the watered wine. On a good day, there might be a small bit of meat or fish, a special treat, but most evenings the meal was plain and humble, enough to fill the stomach and ease the hunger of a long working day, shared in the close company of family. There was a quiet comfort in this evening gathering, the family together at the end of the day in their small room, the father, tired from his labor, the mother, who had worked hard in her own ways through the day, the children, settling down after the day's activities, all gathered in the soft lamplight. They shared their food, and perhaps the small news of their day, the little events and happenings that made up their lives. In this humble setting, far from the grandeur of the great city, there was real warmth, the warmth of family and home, of people who belonged together and faced the hardships of life side by side. The cramped room, for all its poverty, was a place of love and belonging. The lamp that lit the room was a small and precious thing. It burned oil, giving off a soft, warm light and a faint, smoky smell. Oil for the lamp cost money, and so the poor used their light carefully, not wasting precious oil by burning the lamp longer than needed. The light of a single small lamp was dim by our standards, casting more shadow than brightness, leaving the corners of the room in darkness. But it was enough to gather around, enough to see one another's faces, enough to eat the evening meal and share a few quiet words. When the meal was done and the last tasks of the day were finished, the lamp would be put out to save the oil, and the room would settle into darkness for the night. Outside the small window, the sounds of the city were softening into the quiet of the night. The great roar of the day had faded away, replaced by the muffled sounds of a million people settling into sleep. There might be the distant bark of a dog, the faint cry of a baby from another room, the muffled voices of neighbors, the occasional sound from the dark streets below, but mostly the city was growing quiet, the busy day giving way at last to the rest of the night. Soon the night carts would begin to move again through the streets, carrying their loads in the darkness. But for now, there was a softening, a settling, as the great city prepared for sleep. In these last quiet hours of the day, the poor Roman could rest his weary body and let go of the labors and worries of the day that had passed. He had worked hard, faced the dangers and difficulties of his world, found what comforts and pleasures he could, and now he was home, safe with his family, his stomach filled, his body cleaned in the baths, and now eased by rest. Whatever tomorrow might bring, this day was done, and there was peace in that. The simple peace of a day completed, of work finished, of family gathered, of rest finally come. The hard rhythm of his life had brought him once more to this quiet hour, this small, still moment of comfort at the day's end. The children would grow sleepy now, their eyes heavy after the long day, and they would settle onto their sleeping mats on the floor. The thin coverings would be pulled up against the cool of the night. The family would arrange themselves in the small space, close together, sharing their warmth. The poor Roman, lying down on his own simple mat, would feel the deep weariness of his body, the ache of his muscles, the heaviness of his eyelids. The day had been long and hard, and now sleep was coming, the deep sleep of a tired working man, the rest that would restore his strength for another day of labor when the morning came once again. As the lamp was finally put out and the room sank into darkness, the family settled into sleep one by one. The breathing of the children slowed and deepened. The sounds of the city outside grew fainter and fainter. The poor Roman lay in the darkness of his small room, high above the streets, listening to the last quiet sounds of the night, feeling the peace of rest settling over him. The long day was truly over now, all its labors and pleasures and dangers behind him. There was only the quiet darkness, the closeness of his sleeping family, and the slow descent into the deep and welcome rest that the night brought to the weary poor of the great city. And so, as the family slept, the great city of Rome itself was settling into its rest, though it never fully slept. Across the vast city, in countless small rooms like this one, the poor were lying down to sleep after their own long days. The lamps were going out one by one, little points of light winking into darkness across the great expanse of the city, until at last, the city lay mostly dark beneath the night sky. The busy streets that had roared with life all day now lay quiet and empty, save for the night carts that began once more to move through the darkness, carrying their loads as they had done the night before, as they would do every night, in the endless rhythm of the city's life. Above the sleeping city, the stars wheeled slowly across the dark sky, the same stars that had looked down on Rome since before it was great, the same stars that would look down long after. The great temples and grand buildings stood dark and silent in the night, their marble pale in the faint starlight. The forum, so loud and crowded by day, lay empty and still. The baths were quiet now, their waters cooling in the dark. The great racing track and the arenas stood empty beneath the night sky, waiting for the crowds that would fill them again on the next day of games. The whole vast city lay in the quiet of the night, resting before the dawn would wake it once more. In their small rooms across the city, the poor Romans slept the deep sleep of the weary. They had given the best of their strength to the great city, their labor building its walls, carrying its goods, making its things, keeping it fed and clean and running. They had filled its streets and its baths and its games. They were the great mass of ordinary people, on whose backs the glory of Rome rested, and yet their names were never written down, their faces never carved in marble, their stories never told in the great histories. They were the forgotten foundation of the greatest city of the ancient world, the countless ordinary people whose hard lives made all of Rome's grandeur possible. There is something deeply moving in remembering these forgotten people. We remember the emperors and the generals, the great men whose names fill the history books. But it was the poor Roman, the dock worker and the builder, the potter and the seller, the mother in her small room and the children on their sleeping mats, who truly were Rome. They lived their hard lives with courage and endurance, finding what joy and comfort they could, raising their families, doing their work, facing their hardships with a quiet strength that asks for no glory. They are gone now, these countless ordinary people, vanished into the long silence of the past, but their lives mattered, and their endurance deserves to be remembered. We have walked with one poor Roman through a single day of his life, from the cold, dark hour before dawn to this quiet moment of sleep. We have climbed the stairs to his small room, walked the crowded streets, labored through the long hours, rested in the warm baths, joined the roaring crowds at the games, and returned home through the falling dark. We have seen his hardships, and his pleasures, his fears and his comforts, the hard texture of an ordinary life, lived nearly 2,000 years ago in the greatest city the world had yet known. It has been a day full of struggle, but also full of small joys and quiet human moments. A day like the countless days that made up the lives of the common people of Rome. Now the day is over, and the city sleeps. Picture it one last time. The great city lying quiet beneath the stars, its lamps gone dark, its streets nearly empty, its million people resting in their homes, rich and poor alike, at last united in the simple human need for sleep. Picture the poor Roman in his small room high above the streets, his family close around him, his weary body finally at rest, his hard day done. The night air drifts cool through the small window. The last sounds of the city fade into silence. And over it all, the ancient stars keep their slow and patient watch, as the great city and its forgotten people sleep beneath them, gathering their strength for another day that will come, as it always does, with the rising of the sun. It has been a quiet pleasure to walk with you through this single day in the life of a poor Roman, to remember together the lives of those whom history so often forgets. May the image of that sleeping city, peaceful beneath its ancient stars, stay with you as you drift toward your own rest tonight. Sleep well, dear listener, and may your rest be deep and gentle until we meet again in another quiet hour. Good night.